This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
The time is April 14th, 1989, when Tony Danza goes from who's the boss to overprotective dad. Doug Simpson, who is a widower and a radio station manager in California with two daughters, Katie, played by Amy Dolenz, and youngest daughter, Bonnie. When Doug goes on a business trip, Katie's stepmother, Janet, played by Catherine Hicks, gives her a makeover, and Katie transforms her nerdy 50-year-old daddy's girl into a boy-crazy full-on teenager. Doug becomes obsessed with Katie's behavior and her boyfriends, and is consistently afraid she's going to lose her virginity, or is he afraid of just losing his little girl? He seeks psychiatric help, but the advice he's given goes wrong every time he tries to apply it. In a movie that should be called He's Out of Control or She's the Boss, this week we discuss and revisit the reviews from our critics in the 1989 comedy She's Out of Control.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony.
Now, this is one of those movies I didn't necessarily pick or put on the list because I love it, not because I dislike it, and not because I had it on my house the entire time of my childhood. But this is one of those Siskel and Ebert episodes that was one of my first of many. When it comes to their reviews, really had me scratching my head. Now, when it comes to watching this over and over again as a kid, I liked it. I thought it was entertaining. But as a rewatch now, I almost find it more important today in how we parent when it comes to the examples it gives than what I think I would have viewed it as in the 80s. So to me, this was a great rewatch for me. And I think there's a lot of importance to this movie now today.
I mean, so this is a film that I know I saw at some point as a kid because it was on, but because it was about a teenage girl, didn't have any interest for me at the time. So this was essentially a fresh watch for me. And I tell you what, man, I didn't hate it. And I've always been a huge fan of Tony Danza. I've always been sad that we did not get more Tony Danza in movies because he's great for TV, right? Like, he has the face and the voice and the comedic chops for short format television. And, even when he did that Netflix show a few years ago where Josh Groban played his son and they were like father and son detectives, we only got one season of it, but I loved it. I love Tony Danza energy. So rewatching this movie, it made me sad that we did not get more Tony Danza, and not necessarily in father roles, right? I think he was really underutilized in many aspects. But what made me even more sad is how much our critics hated this movie, especially when we just did Blame It on Rio, where one of our critics gave it a thumbs up and actually forgave the inappropriate nature of the film because of the forgiveness at the end. Yet he thought that this film was utterly inappropriate, which it's not, but we're going to get into that later. I'm just going to say right now that I really, really, really dug the Tony Danza, Amy Dolenz dynamic of this movie. I'm not going to say that the movie's fantastic, but it did enough for me to want to watch it again and really appreciate Tony Danza for what he was in the 80s and 90s and how we really miss that kind of dad energy. I think it's funny too, man. Bill Cosby having the, status he does now and how that was like America's perfect dad in the 80s and 90s, where Danza was kind of like a little bit of that black sheep, that New Jersey guy, the taxi guy. We didn't buy him as a dad. If anything, I think he represented more of what a dad could be and really was in the real world compared to like what we saw on TV with the glamorized dad, the overeducated dad. It just, looking back on it now, that hasn't aged well, and I think this ages better.
100%, because Tony Danza plays a character where he's the dad with the appearance that we want to be, but mentally, he's the one that we really can relate to, especially what we've grown into. But this was a great introduction of Tony Danza as a leading man, transferring his who's the boss kind of persona to this one. And I think he does a decent job balancing it. And you touched on the dynamic. This is a believable relationship between a father and daughter. So there's not a lot of conflict between the two. It's what happens on the outskirts of this relationship that is kind of, I wish they had a little bit more, because it almost seemed a little too perfect with their relationship. But at the same time, anything that goes on around these two characters, when they do interact in the situational basis, it is engulfing to see the events unfold. It is well portrayed by these two on how a teenage daughter portrays the teenage lifestyle and how Tony Danza reacts as a father. You can literally feel him constrain himself from things he wants to say. And I know, as a father here of a teenage girl, I've had to do that numerous times. So to me, this was a really relatable chemistry between these two that, you know what, when it comes to the parenting aspect of it, it almost made me feel during my second rewatch that this one was more of ahead of its time back then when it comes to the ideas of parenting. If this came out today, I think there would be a lot more relatability factor to it.
Well, I mean, we've seen various TV shows and even some films and straight to streaming films that kind of follow the same dynamic. It's all dealt with technology now. It's all about getting into the phone and getting into the computer and getting to the social media. But this is pretty proto. This is before all that. What I did like about this movie that I did not see many people talk about, especially our critics or the would-be critics on Rotten Tomatoes and on the IMDb, reviews, is there are instigators in this movie that cause our characters to act the way they do. Like, the dynamic between the father and daughter doesn't really get disrupted until outside influence comes in. So, for example, we do like this girlfriend character who essentially is like a fill-in stepmother for these girls who have been raised without a mom. It is her who takes Amy Dolenz to get the makeover. And it is a makeover. It's not just, let's get you contact lenses and get these braces off. She essentially turns her into Madonna, which I didn't remember that scene so much when I was a kid, but watching it now, I'm like, wow, this isn't just your Saturday, let's go get a facial routine. She is literally recreating this girl's image and psyche. But on that flip side, when Tony Danza is now trying to figure out how to connect with his daughter or get her under control, that's when we bring the Wallace Shawn character. And he is the instigator of Tony Danza's behaviors. Left to their own devices, I think these two would have figured it out on their own. But because there's these outside influences that are so charismatic and convincing, and the twist at the end is we find out that Wallace Shawn doesn't even have a daughter. He's just writing these books and becoming multimillionaire from it. That is another motivator for Tony Danza to realize that, hey, I should have just been a dad. I should have just communicated with my daughter, faced the fact that she was growing up instead of listening to these outside influencers that are making my relationship with her even tougher. No one mentions that part of the movie, and I think that is the crucial part of the film's plot. But it gets worked over because we're focusing on the 80s comedy, the inappropriate behaviors of teenagers, and my least favorite remarks from both of these critics, and that's the over-sexualization of this girl, which I never felt that for 1 second. Maybe a little bit during the beach scene, but it's not from the dad's point of view. It's from the point of view of, you put a girl in a bathing suit, and it's a conservative bathing suit as well. Yeah, you're going to have that typical 80s, oh yeah moment, which it does. I've seen a lot worse in films that were supposedly a lot tamer. So they didn't convince me on that argument at all.
Well, it almost is borderline satire when we're kind of bouncing in between Danza's point of view and then the outside source's point of view. So I think they handled with the direction on it, the Tony Danza point of view, appropriately. I think it was handled very well. Um, but the problem I did have with this was the psychiatric help. Looking at it, there is maybe only one scene here that I said, okay, that's a little too far when it comes to what a dad would do. But the advice given, I don't think it's really ridiculous at all. I'm sitting there during the second rewatch saying, I can see it. I can see that advice. It's tame advice, but when he goes on a spy spree of trying to catch the boyfriend, I think that might have been a little overbearing. But I think a lot of the advice given isn't horrible advice. I think the writing could have gone a little bit further when it comes to believability of that won't happen. That dad is way too overbearing. To me, we don't really define this as overbearing, but more concerned of a father in these situations. And I think it would have really made that twist a really good stinger if it went a little more over the top when it comes to the situations we put Tony Danza in, or stick to the more point of view of Tony Danza of how these boys are coming to the door. Give us more of a thought visual of Tony Danza of how he's viewing these boys, because we see that situation where we see like 15 boys come to the door in quick transition shots, and I wanted to see a little bit more of this dating spree with his daughter. I wanted to see more of what defines this teenager as out of control, because to me this is a good kid, and the movie doesn't prove us otherwise in that. We even get to the climax where we get her making great decisions. So I think there is a couple missteps when it comes to the direction of how the dad is handling situations and how we're portraying the girl, and that even validates your point as well. It's handled well. Her character is handled innocent enough. So to me, I think that was a misstep, but it doesn't take away from the entertainment value of the movie.
Well, I'm glad you kind of mentioned that part about like the overreaction, because I think there's another plot device here at play that may not register with modern audiences, and that is back in the 80s. Psychiatry and psychology was like the new religion, right? And it was everything self-help, self-motivation. People, Tony Robbins, right? Like people all of a sudden in the 80s were lost. Like they came out of the 60s and 70s after their drug-fueled, lost decade. And then they come into the 80s and now they need to like find themselves or help themselves. And so self-help psychology, motivational books, Dr. Phil, all that stuff started really becoming a thing then. And I loved it when movies played the satire of that. I think the movie that really does it the best is Soul Man with C. Thomas Howell. His dad is going through a midlife crisis and takes psychological advice from a psychiatrist going through a midlife crisis who has a psychiatrist who is going through a midlife crisis. And so all of these like toxic tendencies that these psychiatrists are going through, they are now coaching their patients on how to deal with it the way they're dealing with it. So it's like this never-ending circle. It's so ironic, but it's brilliant. And that's the reason why C. Thomas Howell has to go, essentially change his race to get a scholarship because his dad cuts him off. I feel this plays that same level where Wallace Shawn is like this snake oil salesman of self-help and motivation and get your daughters under control, even though he has absolutely no experience in it. So I think it's really playing on the 80s idea of self-help and psychiatry is a new religion, but that concept would be lost on modern audiences who didn't live through that decade. And so I got it right off the bat. Like the reason why Tony Danza does all these extreme things to try and monitor and control his daughter, like Wallace Shawn says, it's all about control. It's snake oil, and that plays in that decade. But now that we're kind of out of that and more into, like listening to TikTok influencers who don't have psychiatric books or self-help books, they're just, hey, don't eat this at the grocery store or break up with your boyfriend, like that kind of stuff. It plays on a different level. But I think that's one of the brilliant things about the writing of this movie is it really doubles down on that to the point of satire, to the point of almost farce. That being said, I do think that it does try to bite a lot off of John Hughes' energy. There is a lot of Ferris Bueller. There is a lot of 16 Candles, especially with the editing and even ripping off some of the music. This is like the third or fourth film that we've heard Yellow's "Oh Yeah," right? Like keep reviewing movies that have "Oh Yeah" in it. But I digress. I think that is something that does not get mentioned in enough critiques or reviews, and especially from our critics, is why aren't we talking about the satirical approach to psychiatry as a new religion in these films of the 80s?
100%. And right when Sean gives that line of, you think I just give this advice, or you think I just afford a house in France and all this
Right.
car. I mean, it paints the picture of kind of that era of what psychiatrist do you know that has a house in France that's not popular. But it almost like common knowledge when you're watching in the 80s that this was popular, and you did have people making millions of dollars on people's mental health. So I think Sean plays that extremely well, and he's an outstanding supporting character in this, and he plays the role perfectly on that. To an extent, I wanted more of him because
Yeah.
I found him a little bit more interesting than Tony Danza to an extent, because he is just such a cartoonish, colorful character to watch. The entertainment value of it, I was begging for more of him, and more of the chemistry between him and Danza, because we see him and it kind of goes from mild introduction to just kind of tensity. And I would have loved to see more of the in between chemistry, because there is a likability, even though you kind of dislike and you get that salesman ish
Mhm.
motif from him. But I would have loved to see an in between these two to really kind of move this chemistry forward to build the stakes. But again, it's all about entertainment value here. And there's nothing that really, again, takes away from the entertainment value of what we see on screen. This almost could have been 30 minutes longer to really add some more pieces into it. And I don't think it would have dragged the movie back. I think it would have really moved it forward when it comes to how we engage with these characters. So that this cast is spot on perfect. And it's just one of those movies I just wanted more of.
And one of the things I keep hearing or reading when I was like digging into the reviews of this, or, critiques, especially on the YouTube channel, just the fact that like, oh, we don't believe that Tony Danza would be this successful as just like a radio station manager. But they do a lot of clever things in the writing that I think supports that. Like, he has a blue collar mentality. And when you think about it, he even drops lines of dialogue of like, oh, yeah, well, I didn't even finish high school and I was like a punk like you. We look at his car, this gorgeous Jaguar. Like, that's something he probably restored himself. This wasn't just a purchase that he was able to do. Everything seems so DIY with him, as if he was a guy that maybe started at that radio station, because we know he has a history in rock and roll. He got to see all those guys, all those bands, be backstage. So he had kind of like that blue collar, start at the bottom and work your way up kind of mentality. That really kind of goes to show in his character, and I think it's delivered perfectly, of why he doesn't understand what most people would consider like common sense in daughter rearing and family rearing. I mean, he's a single dad. But it also shows that like he also isn't very good at his job either when the pressure is applied, and his little side guy is the one that has to like get him to come back to work because he's distracted with his daughter. It kind of goes to show that like, hey, he's been really running life by the seat of his pants, and it's worked out for him. And the reason why he's so desperate now is because for the first time, it's not. And he doesn't know how to handle it. I think that was very cleverly written, very cleverly portrayed by Danza and how it was directed. Yet most of the reviews I read are like, well, he's so dumb, he doesn't even like think about what, the consequences of this overreactive parenting are going to be to his daughter. It's just going to push her even further. And I'm like, did you not watch the movie? That is the point. That is why he faces that realization at the end that she is capable of making good decisions on her own, and that he almost ruins the relationship because of his insecurities, not hers. But that gets glossed over in so many people's viewings of this because of all the things that are just presented to you. The sexuality, the pop music, all these stereotypical dudes that show up at the front door. I think it's almost meta. It's supposed to be that way, but maybe audiences of that time just weren't ready for that kind of in-your-face storytelling and character development.
They're not, because here's what's really glossed over, and I love the fact you brought this up. Tony Danza's 37, 15-year-old daughter, he had a child young. He had his wife die young. They don't let us know when she died, but would have to be young if he's 37 raising a 15-year-old.
Right.
So he had to learn right from him being a young adult of how to raise a kid, how to succeed, how to uh, fight for how to grow his career. He had to do all this by himself. So that is glossed over in the movie, but I think it's actually brilliantly placed because I think if we get too much backstory, then it's going to drag back the movie. So it's perfectly balanced of inserting in between the lines to get those little nuggets to kind of just have us say, that makes sense to me. And it's a relatability factor why this chemistry is so good. And this is why Tony Danza is so underrated because he gets that. He gets he's a 37-year-old raising a 15-year-old. So he understands the in between lines and he just goes with it.
I also think too that when he starts to do the whole if you can't beat them, join them thing, you see that he actually really is having fun with these teens. And he also has that glimmer in his eye that he does miss that lifestyle. And I can almost see him saying, all right, what if we could find a happy medium where they don't do it intentionally, I don't think. I think it's through the performance. But in the scene where he's playing the old records to her friends and everyone loves it except for her punk boyfriend, right? Who is very skeptical about what this guy's intentions are. You almost feel like he really is having a good time. And if he just kind of got over the idea that everyone is out to exploit his daughter, there could be a happy balance. He could be the cool dad, and you almost see that he's fine with being the cool dad. Even to the point where that after the car is destroyed, he still lets these boyfriends who keep getting broken up come in, and he's like a shoulder to cry on, right? So it does show us that he is actually emotionally mature enough to handle these situations. I think in his mind, it's like, okay, well, my daughter just keeps dating dude after dude after dude, which is totally on her, but she's like 15 years old and finally popular. You kind of understand the why, even though we don't really like it. I'm not a 15-year-old girl, but I can empathize with that, right? So all these things that they say were exploitive or unbelievable or just, to the point of farce, I disagree. I think that this was a very intelligently written movie that had just enough farce and satire to get people to buy into it as a comedy and not like a preachy how to parent thing. It's like what Tina Fey did with Mean Girls, right? Like that book that she based it off was a nonfiction book, Queen Bees and Wannabes. And it was kind of icky about how girls treat each other in real life. And she put a comical, farcical spin on it. I feel this does the same thing. I feel that this does that same approach of this actually is something that people really deal with, where fathers get really over possessive of their daughters and don't let them be themselves and grow up. And so we're going to tell a comical, farcical, 80s stylistic version of it. And for me, dude, it totally works.
It does work. And I love that one scene where we have Joey, the punk kid,
who's the
come
most
back
emotional
and
guy in the movie.
Yeah. But we get that pivotal moment too, where Tony Danza he's genuine. And that just puts the exclamation mark on it was a struggle for him to take this advice, to be best friends with this punk kid and to come out of it with the father learning something. That's the first real nugget that we're getting from Tony Danza, evolving as a dad, to really look at the human element of it, that this is another teenager that does have a chemistry that it really does build between all these characters. I love the crescendo of all these chemistries that just they don't throw in characters just to throw in characters. They throw it in to build.
Before we jump into the critics' reviews of this movie and all the drama between them in that conversation, I do have to just put one last thing out there, and that, first of all, rest in peace, Matthew Perry. But I think his character and the way that was handled was so well done, because it is true. The too good to be true guy that shows up and there's no red flags off the bat. If anything, there are an abundance of green flags. I did not remember his whole character arc from that first time watching, But then as it progressed, I'm like, oh, now I get what this guy's motivations are. And Tony Danza can smell a rat as well, even without the book, even without his help from Wallace Shawn. He can tell that there's something not right about it. And all I can say is that thank God that he became Chandler Bing later on, because he played this character so well. It's almost like when Mark Harmon played Ted Bundy and people didn't hire him for years because he was just too believable as this charming psycho. I kind of felt that way about Matthew Perry. He was way too believable as this, kind of smarmy dude who gets what he wants and is very predatory. I was really impressed by that performance pre-sitcom Matthew Perry. And I'm glad that he had such a great role later to clear the palette of that performance.
100%. So this one makes me miss Matthew Perry 1,000 times more than I did, because it was a great trip down memory lane of just this chubby little teenager kid that plays the asshole so perfectly. When it comes to his intent, right? Right from the get-go of just him portraying a teenager where this is going to go. The nicer the guy, the more you distrust him. I mean, he just plays that to a T, and it's buyable. We just love to hate this kid.
Hey, coffee lovers, Antonio and Justin of Back to the Balcony here, and we've got something special for you. If you're looking to start your day with the perfect boost, you need to try Bulletproof Coffee. This isn't your average cup of joe. It's packed with high-quality ingredients designed to fuel your body and mind. Whether you're powering through a workout, tackling a busy workday, or just need the extra edge, Bulletproof Coffee has got you covered. And guess what? We've teamed up with Bulletproof to give you an exclusive deal. Use code B2B, that's B, the number 2B, at checkout to save 20% on your order. That's right, 20% off just for being a loyal listener. So don't wait, head over to Bulletproof's website and experience the difference yourself. Your mornings will never be the same with Bulletproof Coffee. Thank you for listening, and now back to the show. So now getting into the meat of this conversation, this really caustic review from Siskel and Ebert.
She's Out of Control is about a beautiful teenage girl and her father and the boy she dates. But the similarity ends immediately, because She's Out of Control quickly turns into a trashy TV-style movie that tries vainly to satirize its subjects. While the girl's father is out of town, she undergoes a beauty makeover that stuns her dad, Tony Danza, upon his return. That's right, Tony Danza plays a father here, and he plays one quite badly.
Okay, so I disagree with absolutely everything that dude said. First of all, you and I both agree that the satire is intentional, and the satire is what makes the movie work. And Tony Danza's performance as the dad, I don't see him doing a lot of TV comic pratfalls, like tripping over the stool or the couch or the bench in Who's the Boss, right? This one, every time he looks up the stairs and he's got that concerned look or almost like browbeaten look on his face where his eyebrows just sink and his jowls just sink. I'm like, that's real emotion there. I don't know what he's talking about with like this TV comic performance. I saw concerned dad in every expression of his face when something happens where she's about to go out with another boy or she's sneaking in at night. I don't buy the sitcom energy he's talking about.
So to me, I think, one, there's no basis of Siskel to really justify, because he doesn't give the why on Tony Danza on what makes this unbelievable. Because to me, I think he's just that mild father type that really wants to do well for his kid. And I think he portrays it to a subtle manner, to an extent, when it comes to his mannerisms and the way he actually interacts with his daughter. So to me, it's not justifiable by Gene to even say it's not likable, because he doesn't justify the why.
Agreed. And that's like kind of both of them, especially now that we're 35, 36 episodes in, and we do see that contradictory opinion of them for movies that we didn't like and they did, or vice versa. When they have a why, when they legitimately have a why, they make that the bulk of the conversation and the bulk of the discourse. When they don't have a why, it just becomes what this is. Like, okay, well, this guy sucks. This story's terrible. This is cliche, blah, blah, blah. It's all the traditional hit points and hit words that they use. But when they do have a why, they expand on it. Again, I still have not figured out the reason why they do that. But it's becoming more and more obvious and transparent with every episode we do. He continues.
That's Amy Dolenz as the girl. Seeing she's out of control is really a depressing experience. It is neither lifelike nor an effective fantasy. That scene you just saw tries to rip off 10, but it isn't 10. Rather, this film exists in a strange netherworld, I think, of what Hollywood considers entertainment, but is really a sinkhole of tawdry values. The film is photographed ineptly in tight TV shots, and when I saw She's Out of Control, I became so depressed I actually thought about quitting my job as a film critic, feeling as though the movies had abandoned me, because what I was seeing there really wasn't a movie. It was some sort of strange concoction of really just someone who didn't understand what movies were all about. Fortunately, however, I would see the movie Say Anything later in the same day, and all is right with the world. I'm still on the job.
Okay, so drama queen. He let this movie hurt him so much he wanted to quit being a film critic. I really struggle to find what he considers the ineptitude of filmmaking in this, because I did not feel that way whatsoever. And I feel that way a lot when I see movies that are like, okay, this really just seems, I mean, for example, and all love to the guy. And it's funny because I feel like I'm channeling energy today because I woke up late and got our recording time wrong and I threw a backwards hat on and I'm wearing a sports coat and a backwards hat. I'm like, oh, I look like Kevin Smith right now. That's where I'm talking about, where when you watch Kevin Smith films, there is an ineptitude of filmmaking because he wasn't a film school guy. He was a DIY guy, but it's that ineptitude in filmmaking that makes his films charming. So it's a compliment, even though it doesn't feel like one, it is. The ineptitude is obvious, even though we are expecting that from a Kevin Smith movie because that's his style. I didn't feel that in this film. I feel this film is well polished. I feel that the camera work is great. They even showed in that clip one of my favorite shots of when he's taking her glasses off to fit her with contacts, and the focus shifts. That's not inept filmmaking. That's a real stylist visual choice that works because it gives us a point of view of this girl leaving her old life behind and bringing the next one in. And I was totally bought into that. I'm not a Sun Times or Tribune film critic, but even me with my little film podcast can recognize the lack of ineptitude that he's talking about.
What really bothered me in this comment was two pieces. One, he called it a fantasy. It's not a fantasy. Get over this.
It's not a fantasy.
Wrong genre. And then he mentions how tight the shots are. This works for this movie. I love the tight shots. I love the really on-point transitions between them. It borders almost a visual cinematic experience, but sitcom-y. But it just works here because it's almost like our director is really trying to mend the two together just because Danza's in it. But the biggest forte in this is the transition shots, and that's what leads to my opinion of saying it's entertaining because it moves at a brisk pace. There's never a dull moment here, and the editing and the direction is, besides the performances, are really what drive this movie forward. And I love that about this movie. It's not a fault of the movie. It's a positive, in my opinion, because it just works. It matches the tone of the performances. It matches the tone of the storytelling. It just works to me.
And see, that bothered me about this critique too, because we are in the era of John Hughes right now that we're talking about. And, God bless John Hughes. I love John Hughes films, but my biggest issue with John Hughes films is that he has terrible pacing in the second act. Because what he does with every single film is creates a very, lightning quick paced first act. And then for some reason in the middle and into the third act, he decides to get esoteric. He decides to have long drawn conversations or philosophical conversations that don't match the energy the film's created. I think Breakfast Club is the best example of that, where we've created an energy, right? And then we have a fucking 20-minute hug session in the library, right? And then they start smoking weed and wrecking the place, right? There's pacing issues in every single John Hughes movie. This movie doesn't do that. This movie stays a brick pace all the way through. There's distinctive chapters throughout the movie, and they don't draw you in so long that you're waiting for the next one. I really felt invested in every single moment that this movie brought along. And I can't believe I'm defending She's Out of Control more than I've defended other films they've reviewed, But that is what I think the focus of this podcast is like, you need to speak about, we need to call them out on the inconsistencies in their critiques that they give some films a pass, maybe because they're prestige films or prestige filmmakers, but the movie with the TV dad with the New Jersey accent, they're not going to give any validation to. Ooh, it makes me mad.
After reviewing this episode, I always go back, and I know we're going to visit it later on, is the Speed 2. Is out of any movie, this movie makes you want to quit your job. I can, off the top of my head, list 20 movies that made me want to stop watching movies altogether. But this definitely is not one of them. This is in contradiction to them. This to me is an innocent comedy. It's a genuine comedy. This one tells a story of just the chemistry between a father, daughter, and growing up without putting a bow on everything, without making it so fluffy. So this one to me is just an innocent comedy through the Tony Danza's the father, Doug's point of view. And there is nothing that justifies horrible filmmaking. There's nothing that justifies horrible performances. So when it comes to a criticism or a movie critique, I still scratch my head on why, and they don't really justify it at all because there's nothing here that screams horrible film.
You know, people probably think you're joking when you said
No,
you were really thinking of quitting your job, but I know what you felt because I sat there and I thought, life is precious, life is short, and the idiots who made this film are taking 2 hours of my life and robbing it from me in order to give me less than nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, a movie like this is a crime because what it does is it robs life from people by requiring them to spend 2 hours having such a terrible experience happen to them. Now, Jean-Luc Godard, the great French director, once said, the way to criticize a movie is to make another movie, and you put your finger right on it, because the next movie we saw the same day was Say Anything, also about a father, also about his daughter.
Right.
Same kind of basic situation, but here's a trash movie and here's a great movie.
Okay, so here is my thing. Do you like Say Anything?
It runs on kind of the with me. It was good, but meh.
Say Anything is fine. It's a fine movie. Would I get excited to watch Say Anything at any point in time? No. And I feel that way about most Cameron Crowe movies. But I cannot believe that they loved that movie and hated this one. Or maybe they just loved that one so much because of their hate of this one. I don't know. But this, I'm not going to say it's a better made film. Because you know me, my justification, that's different. Like if I'm entertained by it or if I'm invested in the experience of it, that makes it better for me. I'm not saying it's a better made film. But that cross comparison kind of blows my mind because they're two different movies. You know, Say Anything is sentimental, pappy, emotional stuffing, which most Cameron Crowe movies are. You know, and John Cusack, I've always enjoyed John Cusack in the more, I'm going to say, like surrealist comedies, like the Savage Steve Holland ones, compared to this Cameron Crowe stuff, and even High Fidelity, which I like. You know, what's the joke? He's always in the rain. He's always getting rained on. Poor John Cusack has got his heart broken. He's out in the rain. Yeah, those movies, they're fine. This is fun. So it goes to show, it's like, do you want fun or do you want quality? I don't know. I feel like they are so indifferent with how they feel at certain times. Maybe they wouldn't have hated this movie as much if they didn't watch Say Anything in the same setting. I don't know. It's hard to tell. But yeah, I think it's a real interesting take to try and cross compare these two films, as in they are so different, yet they're trying to point out how they are so the same, which they're not.
You can tell it's a misguided review when Ebert starts quoting French filmmakers with a movie like this, because their basis is awful. Now, entertaining versus art house, they can coexist here. But when it comes to how our critics, or any critic, I should say, views it, they don't separate the two. They can't just go along for an entertaining ride. If it's entertaining and that's the filmmaker's intent, not to win an Oscar and just make sure the audience has fun, review it such as is. But if you're going to make a movie like Say Anything and you want to have everything dialed in, you want fantastic, memorable performances, you want to shoot for the thought-provoking aspects of the underlining theme, then that should be treated differently. But they're trying to merge the two and saying, I just want you to make me think, and I don't want to have a good time, and I don't want to have a good time watching a movie that just feels like a sitcom. So these are two separate movies, and they're treating it as one type of movie. The average American buying a ticket for a movie, not everybody wants to go in and say, hey, make me think today. There are days I want to go into a movie and say, please don't make me think, just entertain me. So to me, I think it's the wrong basis and they have the wrong standards of what they're seeing. And that's kind of where we're seeing this spew out and not getting the answer of why this movie's bad, because they don't have one, because they know it's entertaining to an extent and it's not like Say Anything.
Well, and I hated Roger's message of wasted time and wasted life. You know, I don't think that any cinematic experience is a waste of your time or a waste of your life. You can feel that way about it when you leave. You know, your emotions and your feelings are completely subjective, but there are so many things in this world, from food to art to music, whatever, that people are going to like and people are going to hate. And I think the important part of that is to at least experience it, because I don't think there's an experience that's a waste of your time or your life. You know, you can feel about that way later, but when you're in it, you are in it. And I think that is the most important thing. And these guys piss me off too, because they had that big message in so many episodes of like, stay through the credits so you can pay appreciation to the people that made this film. Okay, so only if it's a good movie that you liked. You know, you're not going to follow that same rule for anything. Movies are hard to make. And that is where I get so annoyed by the contradiction in their message sometimes, where it's like, here we're calling this film a waste of life, which is not, but for another film, they'll say, stay till the closing credits to show appreciation to the people that put all their life and love and effort and money into this project. It's like, pick a message.
Yeah, and I preach that all the time too. And even in the worst movie, I'll stay through the credits. And the benefit to this credit is, one, if you get past the director, the writers, and just go through the back end, there's a lot of beginning talent here. And the good news is the credits are less than like 4 minutes long. So there's not a lot of time in these credits, but there's a lot of origin story to this in our culture to really take away. If anything, if you hated the movie, it's a good nostalgic piece to go back and watch these credits to see what came out of making a movie like this. And She's Out of Control to, I don't know, Biodome. There's always going to be something that comes out of this to really take away an experience or a motivation in a later film. So back then, it's easy to say that, but that's still relevant today. And they should know better than that.
It's really bad. I always wonder when I'm in a bad, I don't know if you have this reaction, when I'm in a bad movie in a theater, aren't you surprised that people stay?
I think maybe they've spent their money.
But
they don't have any place to go for 2 hours.
Yes, but I would say this, when you talk about robbing your life, see, my thing I've always wanted to say to people, I've always wanted to stand up in the middle of a bad movie in a theater and say, aren't your lives worth more for 2 hours than even say $7 in New York City? $3.50 an hour. That's below the minimum wage, the new minimum wage. I mean, get out and live.
Go stand in the lobby and talk.
Yeah.
You know? Oscar Brotman, a Chicago film exhibitor, once told me many years ago, he said, there's a rule. He said, if nothing has happened by the end of the first reel, nothing is going to happen.
Yeah.
You know? And when I saw this movie, I knew that after the first minute, I knew that nothing was going to happen.
Basic errors.
So I really am disappointed by that whole closing thing, because these are supposedly, you know, movie lovers. That's why they got into the industry as film critics. And yes, there are good movies and there are bad movies. You know, they have to stay to the end of the movie because they are getting paid. And Gene's whole thing of like, well, isn't your life worth more than this wasted 2 hours of time and life you're not going to get back? Like, that sounds to me like someone who is so done with the movie-going experience. Especially in the 80s. There were so many episodes like this where they just could not stand the movies they saw. And they said the 80s were the decade that killed cinema. It's so disappointing to me that that's what they bring to this, because it almost feels like they've stopped watching movies as movies anymore, and now they're just a commodity, right? Cinema has just become a commodity to them, and this is one of those episodes that kind of shows that. But it's what they do. It's their career. And there's times where all of us hate our jobs. There's times where all of us hate the decisions that we've made in our lives. And this is the episode where I feel that really comes out. It's almost therapeutic for them, right? Like, I feel like they had to purge whatever it was inside of them of not liking films in the 80s. And it comes out in this episode, and she's out of control, was the sacrificial lamb to get this excretion of emotion out.
I get it. I've been there too. But even more recently, at one point I viewed a film and I literally had my hand on the doorknob ready to leave. But then I realized there was 10 to 20 people in the theater and I'm the only one leaving. That means these audience members are taking something away. I have no right to leave the theater. I need to finish this off and give this film a chance. And the fact that they talk about during the first minute to a quote saying, if nothing happens during the first reel, then nothing's going to happen is completely false. Because I stayed during this movie and it was still a horrible movie, but I took something away after I stayed. There were some moments that I can nitpick that I really did like. So to purge a movie after being done, I've been there. I'm at fault for that as well. But you can still take something away. The fact that we don't get one little piece of positivity out of this or one single piece of the why isn't a review. That is a complaint. And like you said, it's a purge of just internal feelings of just being fed up and done. But you still owe it as a film critic to give us the answer of why this is bad, not just quote French filmmakers or a Chicago filmmaker. We don't care about quotes. These are people asking if you would recommend a movie and give me the reason of why.
Yep. And there's no why from either of them in this episode. So when it comes down to it, I really am struggling to find a more disappointing critique from either of these guys in the episodes that we've covered so far. I know that there are more out there and we're going to get to them eventually. But in, like I said, the 34, 35 episodes we've done, this is the one where I feel that this is the most dissatisfying, disappointing, and it really lacks the conviction of a critic, where this is really just a biased, pasted over review, and they don't give us the actual why, other than Tony Danza's not good, and the tight shots feel like it's a sitcom. Get out of here. We already had this conversation with Seems Like Old Times, where that does feel like a sitcom. This does not feel like a sitcom. So when it comes to my critic, Gene Siskel, this is an F. It's a FFF. It's a bad review.
Agree. And you know what? I like my quotations. And you know what? In most cases, Ebert would have gotten some points for giving some quotes, but this is the wrong place, wrong time to do it and with a movie like this. So no why, no justification. He gets a solid 1 star on this one. Not a good review.
Yeah. I feel like we are both on the same page of praising this movie and being harsh on their critique, as they are on the same page of hating this movie and essentially hating people that like movies like this, And it wasn't just on the TV show. Ebert's critique was in the paper. What planet did makers of this film come from? What assumptions do they have about the purpose and quality of life? I ask because She's Out of Control is simultaneously so bizarre and so banal that it is at first the movie fabricated entirely from sitcom cliches, plastic lifestyles without reference to any known place of reality. I don't understand any of that at all. Like, it makes no sense to me. We've said it before. It almost feels like he didn't watch the movie. I'm almost convinced he didn't watch the rest of the movie because it doesn't match what the movie gives. It doesn't. It does not make any sense to me at all.
Maybe that's why there was an awkward silence when they said, go to the lobby and chat, because maybe that's what they did. They got
maybe they went to the lobby and chatted.
Like, is he going to throw me under the bus? So, yeah, 100%. So this is one that sitcom-y, maybe, but fun. So this is a fun watch, and if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend going and taking a look at it, because it is readily available in a lot of platforms right now. But it reminded me also of when Tim Allen first came to the big screen. It's that magic, and when this, with Tony Danza coming to screen, he has that on-screen likability, and the fact they can't even take that away from this movie is a real disappointment.
No, agreed, 100%. So I recommend She's Out of Control. I do. I recommend it. Okay, so next week, we have our first guest on the show. We are doing Star Trek, the motion picture, with our special guest, Josh Scar of the Talking Smack podcast. who closes every one of his shows with watch Star Trek. Well, we're going to make him watch Star Trek. So I'm excited for that episode. I think it's a film that's been long maligned and long misunderstood, and we're going to see what our so-called Star Trek expert thinks about it. You excited for that one?
I'm stoked for this one because I think we discussed this. Out of any Star Trek one, this is the one that really piques my curiosity.
Agreed. So everyone, you know what to do. Find us on social media. We're on Twitter/X, Facebook, Instagram. Like, review, rate, give us 5 stars. Listen to my other show, The Cultworthy Cinema Podcast. You can find me at thecultworthy.com. Find my friend Justin over at
themoviewire.com.
And like we say every episode, please send us suggestions of films you'd like us to cover. As long as Siskel and Ebert reviewed it on their show, anything's game. And like I said, I want you to hurt us. Give us something that we haven't seen or haven't really talked about or liked, and really see if we can get as acidic as Siskel and Ebert were on this movie.
I swear to God, if somebody mentions Biodome since I mentioned that in the movie, I'm going to be pissed.
That's probably going to happen now. Anyway, Justin, I will see you next week.
See you next week.